So with that, we're going to transition into our panel. I invite everyone to eat, keep eating as we work through this. As our panel comes, I invite them to come up and to get set on the stage. So tonight, our panel, we're going to talk a little bit about reproductive justice and reproductive rights, given all that's going on in the world. We know that this is a sensitive and important topic, and that there are many people in the Barnard community working on this issue, but we feel like now is the time to talk about it. This panel doesn't represent every viewpoint, but we have some amazing, amazing alums who are going to share a little bit about what they do, talk about their work in the field, and give a viewpoint from current Barnard staff and from some members of our alum community. We want this to be interactive. There's going to be time for Q&A. So please listen, ask questions, and join and enjoy. So with that, I'm going to invite Marilyn Jimenez, class of 1969, our moderator for this fabulous panel. Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am pleased to be here. And I would like to start with an acknowledgement that we are having this event on the land of the Monse Lenape, who I have been reading about, and they were a female-centered Native American society. So we're privileged to be on their land. I also want to mention that, and there's some people here who have been at the founding of this wonderful event. Francis, from call you out. I'm not sure who else is maybe here, but if it were not for your dedication, we might not have this event for as long as we have had. I'm only going to say a couple of words about the topic of today, and that is given my, the decades that I have experienced. When I was in college, Barnard, my friends and I didn't know about reproductive rights. We had no idea. We could not even conceive of reproductive rights. We had voting rights, we knew about that, but it had never occurred to us that at some point we could have a voice and make decisions about our bodies. Our bodies, at least part of our bodies, belong to someone or something that was not part of us, something that was going to make decisions for us. We never had that growing up. Fortunately, for several generations now, you have not had to experience that. You're fully aware of your rights. But at this moment, we may want to cement those rights, redouble our efforts to continue to expand those rights and support those rights, because you don't want to go back to an age where you felt you had no autonomy in the world. With that, thank you. I would like to introduce our panel one by one and ask them a question. First, we have, please. Virtually, Poonam Dreyfus Pai, she, her, is from the class of 2008 and is the Deputy Director at All Options. And I have a question, as I will have a question for each one of the panelists. As the 1-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision is coming up, can you tell us what the past year has been like for clients seeking abortion, especially those from marginalized communities? What is your organization doing to address these issues and prepare for the future?
Hi, all. Thank you so much for having me virtually. I'm coming in from Oakland, California, where I live, and I'm really sad not to be there in person, but I'm really excited that we're having this conversation. So I want to start with a little context setting. Prior to the Dobbs decision last year, abortion was not readily accessible to everyone for any reason, right? It's really important that we remember that Roe was very much the floor and not the ceiling of what access needed to look like. And so state-based restrictions like waiting periods and gestational bans, federal restrictions like the Hyde Amendment, which prevents us from using federal public funding like Medicaid to cover abortion costs, already made abortion inaccessible for many people, especially people living in poverty and people of color. What the Dobbs decision did do, though, was create massive amounts of confusion and chaos for pregnant people and further jeopardize their health by adding additional burdensome travel, increased costs, misinformation, and limiting the number of providers who could safely and legally provide care. In Indiana, which is where All Options has our statewide abortion fund, we were noticing that this state that usually faced constant restriction itself had now become a space for people seeking care from places as far away as Texas, right, and Florida. And people who have life-threatening conditions like ectopic pregnancies or miscarriages have been turned away from hospitals until they experience severe conditions like sepsis because of the fear that abortion providers have of providing miscarriage management, which is essentially the same thing as an abortion. So I just want to lay that context down a little bit, and also just name that the landscape for pregnant people has been complicated for a very long time, largely due to political intransigence, and remarks like the glib remarks that the SCOTUS briefing read around like increasing the domestic supply of infants for adoption really underscored how little people value the complex decisions that folks are making when they're pregnant, right? Those of us in the reproductive justice space know that adoption is complex and complicated, especially for birth parents and adoptees. The vast majority of people considering abortion are not considering adoption. Most people who are considering abortion are weighing it against the decision to parent, and there have been no additional supports available to people who have to carry pregnancies to term and are now forced to parent. So that's what the landscape looks like in this particular moment. But I'm glad to say that reproductive justice activists, have long known that Roe was hardly enough to provide people with the supports and resources to decide when and if to become pregnant and to parent the children that they have in safe and thriving communities, right? We were prepared for this eventuality, especially once Trump took office and especially after appointing 3 new judges to the Supreme Court. So what's been happening on the ground deserves your ongoing attention and support, even as the news media sort of moves away from the anniversary of Roe being overturned. Abortion funds in particular and grassroots organizations have been building regional networks to fund the cost of abortion procedures, as well as the practical and logistical things like childcare, travel, housing, that allow people to actually access abortion care. At All Options, our mission is to provide support and resources for everyone's experiences with pregnancy, parenting, abortion, and adoption. In this particular work around abortion access, we work closely with regional organizations to support people all over the Midwest. And at the national level, we provide comprehensive support to people who want to talk about their experiences and need emotional support on our national talk line. And we train community providers who work with pregnant people to offer thoughtful, judgment-free options counseling and referrals. So what we need in this moment is a wide network of people who are willing to provide abortion care and all of the wraparound services that actually support pregnant people in making the decisions that they feel are best for them. That's been true for a long time, and it remains truer than ever today.
Are there any individual questions for her at the moment? We can go on and we'll have some questions afterwards. We'll have opportunity. Thank you. Emmy Rodriguez, she allows me to call her Emmy. She, her also goes by Emmy and is from the class of 2013. She is a program director at the New Jersey Family Planning League. Emmy, as we have all seen, the Dobbs decision has intersected with many other issues and has impacted access to other areas of reproductive health and justice. Can you elaborate more on this and also describe a few things your organization is working on?
Thank you, Marilyn. And I want to first thank the Alumnae of Color Committee, as well as the college, for the invitation to be on the panel today. And I wanted to thank my fellow panelists as well, just for the amazing work that you are all doing in the reproductive health space. It's really an honor to be here with you all. And also, hi, Poonam. I'm really sad that you're not here. But yeah, to answer your question, Marilyn, the Dobbs decision, not only did it, strike down the right to abortion at a national level, but it also poses very serious threats to our constitutional right to privacy. And so with the overturning of Roe, it really opens the door for legal challenges to our ability to access birth control and other essential health services, and as well as it can, really threaten case law around marriage equality as well. And so some of what we've seen actually in the last year is that state legislatures are passing bills to restrict access to gender-affirming care for transgender youth. There have been a lot of threats to limit access to birth control at the state level as well, in particular access to emergency contraception. And then we're also, there's actually a court case going through federal courts at the moment that is seeking to strip minors of their right to access sexual and reproductive health care without parental consent in certain states. And so these are just examples that show that, Dobbs was kind of the tip of the iceberg, I think, when it comes to, how the decision really poses a threat to our human right to bodily autonomy, as well as being able to make personal and private decisions about our health, our families, and our well-being. And so at the New Jersey Family Planning League, we are fiercely committed to providing comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services to individuals regardless of their identity, insurance status, or income. And, most of the patients we serve are people of color. 92% of them are low income, and about 40% are actually uninsured. And some of the ways that we really try to ensure and protect access to services for these populations is to make sure that our services are either provided for free or at very low cost. We also offer ample weekend and evening clinic hours so that people can come in when it's best for them, as well as telehealth services. We offer language assistance for people who may not speak English. We have transportation services available as well through programs like Uber Health. And we work really hard to protect patient confidentiality by ensuring that minors, as well as people of all ages, who need access to these services can do so safely without a parent or a partner or spouse, knowing if that's something that they need. And so, one of the things that my organization, the League, has also done post-Dobbs is some of our health centers have started to provide medication abortion as well. And that was done intentionally to expand access to abortion care for not only residents in New Jersey, but also anyone who's traveling from out of state and may seek care in our state. And we're also working with the New Jersey Department of Health at the moment to start a abortion access project. And the purpose of that project is to really create a network of publicly funded abortion providers in the state of New Jersey that can really address the gaps, not just in service delivery, but also in public education about abortion, and to be able to provide practical support to patients who are seeking abortion services in our state. And so those are just some of the things that we've been doing pre and post Dobbs to really meet the need and to ensure that access remains available to people regardless of their background.
Thank you for that. And I look forward to hearing more about all of these activities. Let's turn now to Ty Cornell, they, them. It's from the class of 2017, and it's a program associate at Plan C Chi. In the past few years, we have heard so much about misinformation and disinformation. Can you tell us a little more about what your organization, Plan C, does to promote up-to-date information around abortion care and why it is so important? As a recent alum, we would also love to hear more about how you got interested in working in reproductive justice.
Well, thank you to everyone for being here, for listening to us speak on this. As Evelyn and Poonam have both mentioned so far, we are in a really critical period. So it means a lot to all of us, I'm sure, that you're all here to listen to what we have to say. So thank you again for inviting all of us. So as Emily and Poonam both laid out, the situation right now under Dobbs is one of a lot of confusion and a lot of potential disinformation. Because the laws in different states are changing day by day, it's not always clear what is available to you depending on where you live. And even before when Roe was a law, it was still not clear what was actually available to you based on the state that you were living in, based on your locality, based on whatever the case may be, right? So Plan C, my organization, what we do is we are an information campaign. We're a nonprofit dedicated to giving people information and information not only about what abortion pills are, which I'll get into, but also about how they can access these pills by mail in the US, regardless of where they live, and regardless whether they live in like the contiguous like 48, whether they live in a US territory, wherever the case would be, they can still access abortion care. So we're dedicated to talking about the safety, the accessibility, and the effectiveness. Effectiveness is 95 to 98% of the abortion pill. So I'm gonna like define this term medication abortion because it's gonna come up a lot in what I'm talking about. So medication abortion is usually defined in contrast to something called surgical abortion, which we are probably more familiar with. Like that's what tends to be depicted in a lot of our media and like what we tend to think of when we think about abortion, right? So you're going to a clinical site or something like this, you're going in pregnant and you're leaving not pregnant because you had a surgical procedure at that time. In contrast, medication abortion was discovered by a woman in Brazil in the 1980s. And it's a process where you take a medication called misoprostol, and it facilitates that abortion without you having to have a surgical procedure. Now, this pill is available over the counter in many countries worldwide. Unfortunately, not in the US at this time, but it's definitely a safe and effective method of abortion. So kind of going into that also, what we do have like data-wise in this country is the fact that the majority of abortions performed even in the US at this time are performed using medication abortion. So this is nothing new. It's just something that for political reasons has not really been talked about, not necessarily like having regular people be aware of it as an option. So that's medication abortion. So what Plan C does is we tell people about medication abortion. Like many of you may have just now learned what medication abortion is. So that's our whole thing, like introducing people to the concept, also letting them know how they can access pills regardless of where they're living. And we do this through things like social media campaigns. We do sticker campaigns where we basically mail people stickers and they can put up stickers in their local community, basically linking to the Plan C Pills website. And they can see like what access is like in their state, again, accessible in all 50 states. And also information about how to use the pills, what's the safety level, effectiveness, all this type of stuff that I was just talking about. So that's a way that like any of you could like, get the word out. We also do things like providing links out on our site to sites like If, When, How, or the M&A hotline that give you either legal or clinical support if you're wondering, or in a like distress situation or something like that. So like, that's a lot of what we do. We just get the word out and let people know like, what's good with medication abortion, so people are not aware. So for me, the why that's important, especially in this period, there's a lot of confusion. We got to remember that even before this period, in the Roe period, as Poonam was saying, there was definitely a lot of confusion about what even is abortion? Like, how does that work? Like, what's good with that? Like, a lot of people are very confused about this, and it allowed for a lot of misinformation to kind of get into the space and things like crisis pregnancy centers, where people would think that they were going to a place where they could access kind of like Poonam's organization, all options, but actually they were kind of limiting people's options, giving them disinformation about their status and things of this nature. So kind of in this situation, Plan C stands in the gap and like allows for information about this option to be transmitted so that we don't have to live in a state of confusion and not knowing like what's going to happen to us if we are living in a state where we know that abortion care is definitely restricted. So for me personally, though, like the reason that this is really important is because I think about the situation before Dobbs all the time. And the situation on the ground was that if you were a Black woman, if you're a trans man, if you are non-binary of any type, if you don't have $1,000 lying around, if you're a person of color of any type who can bear children, if you maybe are on Medicaid, you may not be able to access abortion care. However, the fact that on Plan C's website, we tell people about the option of accessing abortion pills by mail, either through a provider or through a site that sells pills, it means that you do not have to think before you try to make a choice that you know is right for you. You don't have to think about the racism, the discrimination, the homophobia, the transphobia, just the day-to-day things that can get dredged up every single time that you go to the doctor. You can just order the pills that yourself and facilitate your own abortion if that's your choice. So that's for me, like why it's important. That's how I got into all of this. So I've kind of always been like this. I remember like, definitely like thinking back in my early life and everything, I had a lot of questions about like, like what is the situation? Like you've told me that sex exists, you've told me how a baby is made, but like practically, like what does that mean for my life? Like I really didn't have a good understanding because of the sexual education that I didn't really get where I was growing up, which is the case for many of us, not just in the South, but across this country. So I was constantly like on the internet searching up these answers because I had to have these answers. I wanted to understand like, what is my risk of pregnancy? What is my STI risk for certain activities and stuff like that? And kind of in that place, when I got to Barnard, I was able to study and meet new people and like get a better understanding of like through biology, which is my major, but also through learning about concepts like biopower and the intersectionality, excuse me, and the axes of power that were at play to put me in that position where I was in need of information instead of just getting the information that I needed. And during the pandemic, I was just suffering like everybody. And I was like, you know what? I think I want to do what I want to do, which is talk about this stuff all the time. So I decided to make a career change. I got some doula training and I was like, I don't know if doula training, being a doula is for me. But I definitely was able to transition in my career into like working at the NYC Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, like around this issue, and then to Plan C, where I'm still working on similar issues.
Thank you very much, especially for telling us how you came about to this decision. Next, we have Dr. Sarah Ann Anderson Burnett, MD and PhD. She, her, is the Director of Clinical Services and Quality Improvement at Barnard College, and a clinical assistant professor in pediatrics at Columbia University Urban Medical Center. Dr. Burnett, we have been speaking a lot tonight about reproductive rights and justice. Can you share with us a little more around what you see as the difference between these concepts and how it relates to access to abortion services, as well as securing safe and healthy environments for young adults to be educated about their bodies and identities?
Marilyn, it's a pleasure to be here. Although I'm not a Barnard alumna, I do consider myself a Barnard baby. I have to tell y'all this story because it's actually really great. My mother attended here at Barnard. Her roommate, Dr. Brenda Aiken, is over there. And it's just a small world. Dr. Aiken is essentially the counterpart of my role at Columbia. So it is the Barnard legacy continuing and the Alumnae of Color amazing work that you've done and invested in the future. And I can be a representation of that manifestation. So special shout out to you. I had to do it. But for me, I think so often reproductive justice is conflated with the concept of reproductive rights. And there is a very clear distinction. Reproductive justice was born in response to the alienation of people of color from the reproductive rights movement. When we think about reproductive rights, it's the individual right to secure access to reproductive health services. And primarily the focus has been on access to abortion. That is absolutely critical. However, a group of Black women who formed Sister Song Women Collective, Reproductive Justice Collective, created reproductive justice because they felt that the voices of the most marginalized, the voices of those who are seeing the great impacts of Black and Brown maternal morbidity and mortality, who are being ostracized, don't have access to the rights that were supposedly secured. As all of our panelists have outlined, even though Roe was in place, that did not guarantee access. And so I think when reproductive justice was created, it was created as a lens and an activism framework. And it's a critical framework because it looks at the full spectrum of the humanity, of social justice and human rights together. And it's looking at the ability and the autonomy that individuals have. So you have the right to choose to prevent a pregnancy or terminate a pregnancy. You have a right to parent your children in safe environments. It's a full spectrum of healthcare, of wellness, of well-being, and living your best life that reproductive justice is focused on. And so often, unfortunately, and this is my hot take, but unfortunately, reproductive rights and reproductive justice get conflated together. But there's a very, very clear distinction. And that distinction is the voices of the marginalized, of Black and Brown people, are at the center. So I think that's the key. And it's just an area that I think is absolutely critical. It is the driving force behind how I perform care, how I interact with patients, how I believe that each patient is the expert on their body. That's hard, right? Because as a medical provider, I wasn't taught that. You know, medical paternalism is very much entrenched in everything that we do. And so to allow and come in and say, oh, you know what you're talking about? The doctor's like, wait, hold on. I wasn't trained that way. You know, you have to readjust. And it's really, truly unlearning a lot of white supremacist structures that have been placed into our systems that perpetuate the disparities that we see. And so when I'm thinking about equity, I have to unlearn for myself as a Black woman who has experienced the negative side of the healthcare system myself, that some of the things I do took away my patient's autonomy. Some of the counseling I provided was not effective because it didn't center their experience or prioritize their values. Their values may not match my values, but in this scenario, my values have no preference. The precedence is yours. And so I think, and we're thinking about reproductive justice, it's a complete framework flip. And that's really hard because so often when we're focusing on access to abortion, we're not thinking about those folks that are in communities who don't even have physicians within 30, 40, 100 miles, right? We're not thinking about these folks that are really actually dying. I really recommend folks watch the documentary Birthing Justice. It gives a really great perspective on what the state of affairs currently are and why reproductive justice is the necessary framework needed to propel our country forward.
Thank you very much for all that you have shared this evening. I have one more question and request from you, and that is, you have been very much involved in reproductive rights. You work at it every day. What can we do? One or two things that you recommend that each and every one of us can do to protect and ensure reproductive rights and justice?
Do you want to start with me, or I'm sorry, I can't hear anything beyond when the mic is passed.
I'll turn it over to you, Poonam.
Oh no, go ahead. You can go. I can go after you.
Well, I was just, first thing that came to mind is being involved in your local elections is super important. If you're not registered to vote, definitely do that. There are much, higher voter turnouts during national elections, but local elections really sometimes matter more because a lot of these challenges and cases that we see that make it to the Supreme Court actually start in your home state. And so it's really important that you become familiar with, who's running, their platforms, what types of things do they stand for, and, make a plan to vote, bring a friend, but also take care of yourselves because, the last 3 years have been very challenging. COVID, a lot of these legal challenges that we're seeing, the overturning of Roe. So also practice a lot of self-care when you're, kind of jumping into this advocacy role as well.
I'm gonna go ahead and talk. I can't hear anything when folks aren't talking in the mic. I'm sorry. So I'm gonna name 3 things that folks can do. I think first and foremost, there are over 100 abortion funds in this country. Abortion funds are local organizations that are mainly powered by volunteers, although not exclusively so, that work to support people in accessing abortion, right? They provide money, they provide resources, they provide accompaniment and assistance, doula care, all numbers of things. And they really could use your support. They're doing the work, they've been doing the work for a long time, and can use more money always, and volunteers who are interested in again, following the leadership of mostly people of color who are running these organizations. So that's one, find your local abortion fund and support it in any way that you can, in any way that feels feasible to you. 2, I would say, if you, the line goes, everyone loves someone who's had an abortion, right? So that means, and you probably know someone who's had an abortion. If you don't, that just might mean that they haven't told you about it. So do what you can to be someone who is open-hearted and compassionate about people's pregnancy experiences, because we just don't know all of the nuances and all of the complexities that people are holding and facing and figuring out as they find out about a pregnancy and figure out what they want to do next. So be someone that that someone can tell their abortion story to, be someone who is willing to listen thoughtfully and without judgment to someone's experience, right? I think the more that we can be that, the less stigmatizing abortion becomes over time. And then lastly, if you are interested in like learning more about how you can provide care, or especially around counseling and stuff, look up All Options. I think we do really fantastic work for almost 20 years on really creating what I feel like is a softer ground for pregnant people to land on, and creating a space for folks to experience compassionate, open-hearted, judgment-free support. So look us up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions or topics that we haven't touched upon yet that you feel is important for us to discuss anything?
Sure, I had suggested things to do. Almost jumping off what Poonam said, it's important, of course, to donate to your local abortion fund, but since many of us may be living in New York where our, I don't want to say anything is guaranteed, but like I think for the most part, I'm really hedging for a good reason, I promise, is that, it's hard to get where you need to go to get a surgical abortion. For the most part, I think that New York State probably has a lot of local abortion funds that are well funded. However, it might be worth taking the time to think about a state that you maybe have never thought about before and donating to their local abortion fund as well. Maybe like, one week you do New York, the next week you do Oklahoma, something like this, just so that we can make sure that all people in our country are able to still access this critical care. So that's one thing. The other thing that I would say is, keep the entirety of reproductive justice in mind. Like, it's not just about abortion. It's also about making sure that, people that want to have children are able to raise them in safe places and with support. So for those of you who, everyone is aware at least of children in their community and like making sure that you are caring for these children, like perhaps being you yourself, that safe space for children, I feel is very important. And third, because I'm at like 1.5, like I have one more. Last one for me would be, if you want to like spread the word about like the availability of medication abortion, you can like come find me afterwards and like take a sticker from me and you can put it up in your local community. And if you're not the type to like tag stuff in the city, I get that. I'm not really like that. You can do what I do and give them to friends, like give it to maybe a young person in your life, explain what you learned today and be like, oh, why don't you just put this somewhere? It could be helpful to someone, this sort of thing. So those are my suggestions.
I'd like to turn to the audience now and see if you have any questions, comments. And if you do, there is a microphone somewhere here. And if you, oh, I am totally blind. It's right there. And there's another one there. Feel free to come up.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Hi, everyone. Thank you how to be here tonight on my question. Kind of the obsession with first shadows. As you might have heard, I was young when that news about woman as the God said us without their consent. As
So, Sarah Kim has a question which is kind of the opposite of abortion, and it's forced sterilization, and she's asking about the recent event about ICE forced sterilization, which has come about.
yeah, and no, us, but there has been a history in America woman of color and woman with disabilities got particularly serious without being diagnosed, and I was wondering why, yeah, that's my not being in the mainstream discussion of reproductive rights.
She's wondering why this aspect may not be in the mainstream discussions about reproductive rights.
That's a fantastic question. And when we think about why reproductive justice was born, it was born out of the idea of the legacy of reproductive coercion and oppression, right? So we know we have a long-standing legacy of performing surgeries on Black women that were enslaved without anesthesia. And once the surgery was perfected, then performed on white women with anesthesia. But the idea of eugenics and the idea that they did not have pain sensors, that really sets the precedent and the foundation for a lot of the things that happened to follow. So we know things about La Operación that happened in Puerto Rico, where they were giving forced hysterectomies, essentially same thing with the Mississippi appendectomy. And then you come all the way, people are like, well, that was back in the day, that's not happening now. Well, things like forcing folks that were in prison or incarcerated to have a long-term or a long-acting contraception placed in order to get public subsidiaries. There are ways that coercion continues to present itself, and the ICE scenario where they were forcing hysterectomies, where people who were actually the victims of rape were forced to carry pregnancies that were unwanted. There are continued horrors that are still being enacted daily. And it really shows you that it's not just a legacy of reproductive coercion and oppression, it's a continuation. And that's why it's so important to disrupt the system, because it's continuing to be perpetuated.
Thank you very much for that. Any other questions, comments for our panel or amongst yourselves?
While people think about whether they want to come up to the mic, I just wanted to put in a plug because I used to be a volunteer for All Options. I know Poonam talked about it briefly. I'm really happy to talk to anyone who might be interested in learning more about All Options. They're a super amazing organization. It was the most fulfilling volunteer opportunity I've ever had done in my life. And anyway, just wanted to put in a plug for that because they're awesome.
Thank you. Anyone else want to point out their organization? I think, Poonam, you have already made a pitch, but you can pitch some more.
Hi,
Oh,
well,
thank you.
yeah, thank you guys for this amazing panel and for all the beautiful gems that you dropped on us today. I think I have two questions. So my first question goes back to this question of how to really promote self-sustainability in this practice. I think that something that all of you, I feel like, really emanate is like bringing in community as a way of working with self-sustainability. But I think I'm interested in hearing more individually about how you guys navigate this very obviously stressful time and engaging with this on a daily basis, engaging with people who need help. And what are some best practices that you've picked up in order to sustain your own well-being? And then my second question has to do with something Kai brought up about really educating youth about this. And I would love to hear about what are some things that you guys are, best practices for engaging with youth on topics surrounding reproductive health and reproductive justice. And yeah, but thank you so much for everything.
To that first. To answer the first part of your question, I would say that as far as self-sustainability, I think it's very important to take your rest as seriously as you take your work. Like, I have watched my immigrant mother work herself into the ground, and my immigrant uncles and my immigrant aunt. And I decided that I could not do that, and they had sacrificed for me so that I would not have to do that. So for me, I feel like it's almost an act of respect to them and the work that they've put in for me to be here, for me to make sure that I do not have to work myself to the bone, just because I've watched that be modeled for me. So that's definitely one thing. Like, and for me, I'm an introvert. So rest looks like a lot of like, chilling in my room, like reading a book, laying down, like playing video games, whatever that is. But I also, love being in community and love being around my friends. So making time for them as well has also been a crucial part of like how I rest and recharge. And now to the second question about how to engage youth. That can be extremely difficult, as we know, having all been youth, because I don't want to talk to my mom about any of this stuff. Like, I don't want to talk to any adults in my life about any of this stuff. There's a reason I was like by myself on the computer. But like, it's because it's hard for any person, I think, to show that level of vulnerability, because really at the core of a lot of our questions around sexual health and reproductive health, at the core of it is like what we want, what we might find pleasurable and things of that nature. It's very difficult, I think, for a youth, someone who is young to speak about those things to anyone else, much less an authority figure in their life. So I've seen two tactics. One of them is to like make sure that, we've all seen like these books that like talk about like puberty and all this type of stuff. It's good to just, I think in general, have books in your home and just leave them out. Don't like hide them in your own room, and like make sure that they're accessible to whatever youth might enter your space, so that if they have a question, they might be like, oh, that book is like, it has a title I'm really curious about. And like Auntie's not around, like maybe I can check into this myself. Like they don't have to know that you put that there for them. Like that's one option. Another option is like becoming more aware of the online resources that are available. Two that I'm thinking of right now, this is maybe a little bit outdated because like, I'm a little bit outdated at this point, but Scarleteen is really, really, really great for youth. Like it has a lot of like searchable questions and stuff like that people can access and like easily find a lot of information about the types of questions they're having about whatever they might be interested in. I still like, if I'm like, oh, I forgot this one thing about this one SDI, let me like just go on Scarleteen. It's really easy to find. It's that easy. And like, I still use it myself. So that's another option. Looking into online options that might be really good to like, suggest to youth, or again, just, leave a sticker or a magnet out on your house and they'll be like, I wonder what that is, and look into that on their own.
The site amaze.org. It's phenomenal. So this is a pediatrician in me coming out, but it's the full spectrum. It starts from very early on, how to talk about gender identity, how to talk about sex, how to identify anatomy. I think it starts very young, right? Teaching your child their proper anatomy terms. Like, for example, we taught my daughter about this is your vulva. And so that was very hard for my husband. He did not do well initially, especially when she ran in the hallway saying my vulva itches. But she knew what it was and she was correct. And I was like, I'm proud of you, boo, you did it. So I think just like empowerment from a young age, because I think some of it is rooted in our own fear of talking about our bodies and the negative experiences we may have had when people talked about bodies. And so really unrooting that very early, but then providing resources, as Kai mentioned, is so important. One of the things that got me interested in medicine, my mom left out a book called The Child is Born. I still have it. And it is for like that age, I was like 6. It was very graphic, but it was like the pure pregnancy, labor. I mean, I saw the whole thing. I love that to this day because it was actually one of the driving forces of me understanding and asking questions. So having that curious mindset and cultivating that in your child and your youth is really important. I think people assume you come to Barnard, you might have had great sex education. No, in sex education, the state of sex education is almost non-existent in the United States, including in New York City. And so I think there's a baseline assumption that you're getting exposure and you're not. And so a lot of our clinical visits here is our education. We have a whole health promotion team because we have to make sure that folks are aware about their bodies and what they can experience with their bodies and when to be concerned so that we can continue to support them. So using those resources starting young are very important.
I'd love to add just a few things to that also. I think one, remembering that if a young person is old enough to ask a question, they're old enough to receive an honest answer is like a really core piece of supporting and involving young people in these conversations and in this movement, I think, because they also deserve bodily autonomy. They also deserve to be heard and treated with respect and dignity, right? And I think as both Kai and Dr. Anderson Burnett already mentioned, like fear is at the root of a lot of things that we do or don't do for our children, right? Because we want to protect them, because we want to keep them children as long as possible. And at the same time, the reality is like, if they're not getting that information from you, they're going to get it from somewhere else. So let's try to find as many safe, reliable resources as possible to give them honest answers about the questions that they have. There's a great book that came out last year called What is an Abortion Anyway? It's a picture book. It's available in both English and Spanish. That has been really great for me in having conversations with my two daughters about pregnancy and abortion. And I couldn't recommend it highly enough. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, to answer the question about self-sustainability, I had two thoughts. One was there, I think in a lot of activism spaces, there has long been sort of this this glamorizing of martyrdom, right? Where you work and you work and you work and you work and you're not down enough for the cause unless you're working all the time. And I think the reality is like that really negates the reality that this work is driven by community. It is only possible through relationship, right? With one another, within our communities, between communities, right? That's the way that this work moves forward. And so remembering it doesn't always have to be you, right? It doesn't always have to be me. It doesn't have to be any one of us at all times, all the time, right? But that we can have our seasons of rest and we can have our seasons of work. And that in order for it to be sustainable, we have to be able to rest, as Kai was saying. The other thing I was going to mention around that is the thing that also brings me energy. I'm also an introvert, but the other thing that brings me energy besides rest is actually having space to dream. So much of the reproductive rights conversation is often about what we're fighting against, what we're up against. And one of the things I love so much about reproductive justice is it really helps us envision what we want the world to look like, right? Like what are our imaginations? What are the sort of deepest, purest, wildest dreams that our imaginations and our ancestors have had for us? And how do we make those possible, right? How do we create those realities? And I feel like that's also a really energizing and self-sustaining and life-giving space, right? To not always be in this place of opposition, but to really be in this place of visioning. So invite y'all to think about what's the world you want for yourself and what's the world you want for your kiddos or loved ones that are young in your life. And how can we bring that forward with them?
Hi, I want to thank you for this panel. I learned tonight the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And I have a question. I'm a little nervous, but I want to just see if you can help me with this question, because I think each of you has expertise. And so I'm not thinking about the people in this room who are educated and in charge of their bodies and wanting to have make decisions if they have a pregnancy or thinking about their reproduction. I'm thinking about women who are not thinking about those things. They're having sex. They may be, may have drug addictions. They may be homeless. They may have mental health issues. And they're not trying to have an abortion because they're not in charge. They're not in charge of their reproduction the way we all are talking about. And I'd like to know how the reproductive justice platform, how the work that you do supports those women who find themselves pregnant, who have babies, who leave them at the hospital, how it supports those babies who come into the world with different challenges, and that part of the story. And so I'm not here, of course, to say that we shouldn't, I don't believe in sterilization, forced sterilization, and those kinds of things. But I'm just wondering what, and I know you have thought about this because of the work you do. Where does the justice fit in for those women and for their children, and how do we think about these issues, not for the people who are so in charge of themselves and their lives, but the ones who are really not in charge of their lives in that moment when they have this pregnancy. Thank you.
I guess just to build off what some of my panelists have talked about with regard to reproductive justice, it's not just about pregnancy, adoption, parenting. It's also about the societal structures that support an individual, a family, to have children or not, raise them in the way that they would like to. And so that means having the mental health services available to support families and their well-being, having the means to buy diapers, formula, whatever it may be. Having structures in place for affordable housing so that people are not, in that situation in the first place, right? It's all of that. It's everything we've talked about and beyond that, as Poonam was saying. I think one of the ways, and I can just speak to, how the health centers that we work with at the New Jersey Family Planning League really try to ensure that people have access to these other, social supports that are really important, is that a lot of our health centers will screen for these socioeconomic factors that impact people's lives. So depression, substance use, and then making those referrals, following up, so that people are walking away with the care that they need and, are making whatever decision they've made, right? Whether it's in that visit or a future visit, that they have the support to carry that out. I think I'll stop there because I'm sure my panelists have more to add to this topic.
think Emmy so nicely summarized that. And it's really the infrastructure, right? We're building an infrastructure that allows for communities, not just individuals, to thrive. And that requires equity. Equity is not equality, as we all know. And so that requires giving more resources to those that are under-resourced in order to allow for them to thrive. And so I think it's thinking about those who are often, as I mentioned before, it centers a marginalized voice. And that's from every aspect. It's not just simply race or gender identity or ableism. It goes expanded. Any system of oppression that oppresses one's identity is what reproductive justice is focused on, because they're just as important as anyone else. And so I think that's the critical part of it, is that why it's a framework and an activism framework, because it's really going at the power structures of at play that lead to oppression. And so it's understanding, like Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, and knowing that opposing, you can have multiple identities of oppression that really affect your ability to live and survive in our society. And it's important that we address each of those in its totality rather than focus only on the individual components, because you are a whole person with multiple identities, and all of those identities should be able to live and thrive and live healthy. So I think that's the concept behind reproductive justice and how it's being in place. I think what's hard is there's not like a training center for reproductive justice. So what happens is the term gets co-opted and it's not being implemented as it was actually created. And so, really going to the source material, going to Sister Song, going to other folks to really understand, like, these are the practitioners that are doing this day in and day out, talking to the amazing people on this panel that are living this day in, day out. How can we apply this into our communities? How do we improve outcomes and really improve lives by applying these concepts? Because the concepts have been fleshed out, but how folks are using them have not necessarily been used in the way that it's intended.
Hi, I'm Catherine Brewster, class of 1971. And I just want to mention that the other element of how we help all of us in this time and in terms of promoting reproductive justice is there is a document, it's education. and film can be an absolutely great way. And members of the Barnard class of 1971 have developed a documentary series called Stand Up, Speak Out, The Personal Politics of Women's Rights. If you go to www.bcvoices.org, and our third episode is on reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and there are personal stories of women from multiple generations telling what it was like to have sterilization abuse in the family, what it was like to have abortions pre and post Roe, what it was like to have birth control or not have birth control available, and what has been the benefits of family planning. So it's a potential resource to try and communicate in a very visceral heart level what it is like to have and have not these rights and have reproductive justice in our lives. And we're currently working on 200 years trying to communicate in a very short documentary the struggle over 200 years plus ongoing to have these in our life and not. So in terms of education, it's one resource of many that are available.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. And at this point, I would like to thank the panel. But before I do, I just want to add one more thought. And that is, it comes from a story by Henry Dumas, an African-American writer, poet, who was killed not far from here as he was walking down the subway by a policeman. And that was in 1968. One of his stories tells the story of a bookstore in Harlem. And the bookstore owner, bookstores, by the way, are very important in African-American communities. The bookstore owner says, when asked, why does he have this bookstore? And he says, it is pride dressed in knowledge. I would like to riff upon that and say, you have brought us knowledge dressed in pride and action. Thank you very much.